area. We had Cobb and Co. using 2,400 horses a day as they developed the transport system. We'd built a transcontinental railway, and we hadn't got in debt. And then we came together and we formed one nation, and we opened our first parliament, and one of the first things that happened was that we had a very colourful character by the name of O'Malley, who was a member of parliament for a Tasmanian seat, who'd been a banker in America and had also been a head of a church. I don't know what the name of the church was, but it was a pretty rough mob, I think. And O'Malley said in Parliament, if this young nation is to retain its sovereignty and its freedom, we've got to finance ourselves. Because if we start borrowing money overseas and get this nation into debt, we will simply become slaves in some future time. And in the speech he made in Parliament, he said, what we're debating here is about the future of our kids and future generations. And what we ought to do is to start a people's bank that can do what Alan pointed out, create our own money as a measured expansion against the expansion of the physical Australia. And after a lot of debate and a lot of opposition, incidentally, in 1911, they opened up a little bank in the middle of Melbourne, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. It was a people's bank. It didn't belong to the private sector. They bought a second-hand building and they wanted to make it look nice. So they made two nice bronze doors, which they always do, of course, and you walked in through that, and behind a counter there was a young Australian by the name of Miller, Denison Miller, who'd got this job from the Bank of New South Wales. Anybody know what the Bank of New South Wales is now? Westpac. Used to be the Bank of New South Wales. He'd applied for the job for this new bank, and they said, all right, you're the sole boss. You're the director. There'll be no board. You just run this bank. And he said, well, that's easy enough to say, but I haven't even got any money of my own. Oh, they said, we better give you a kitty to start with. So they took £10,000, and we were on pounds then, out of the government revenue, and they put it in this funny little bank in Collins Street and said, away you go. And that money was repaid within 24 hours, £10,000. And he started making deals. He went to the Melbourne Board of Works, which borrowed all its money on the London money market, and said, what do you pay? And they said 6.5%. He said, I can do you the same job for 4% or under 4%. And he signed up. The first deal the Commonwealth Bank ever made was for over £1 million for the Melbourne Board of Works. And only a few months later, because the bank officially opened in 1913, they had to fight a war. Now, what normally happens in a war? You get debt after debt after debt after debt. Britain borrowed all the money to fight that First World War in America on Wall Street and is still paying the debt off. She has paid the First World War debt 2.5 times and currently owes more than she borrowed. The final payment is scheduled in the year 2004, but she's not going to make it because she's dropping behind. Australia didn't do that. They went to this funny little bank in Collins Street and said, can you finance the war? And he said, yes. How much do you want? And they said, well, big bickies. We've got to turn the whole economy round to wartime production. We've got to turn farmers into soldiers. We've got to stop building tractors and build tanks and warships. Well, he said, I can do that. So he got a Commonwealth Bank cheque and he wrote, payable to Department of Defence, £350 million. And they said, boy, because that was a lot of money. Well, that's terrific. What's the rate? What do we have to repay? He said, well, I've got to charge you something because under the legislation which set the bank up, I've got to make a profit. So I'll charge you interest, and the interest will be 5/8 of 1%. That is a fraction over 0.5%. And on that interest rate, the Commonwealth Bank made a profit of £20 million in the 4 years of the war on 0.5% interest. Now, this was so dramatic and so different from what England and the other countries had done that in 1920, in June, Denison Miller was over in London fixing up a deal on what had happened to Australian wool, because there'd been a lot of wool there that hadn't been paid for. And he had a press conference, which is in the papers. And they said to him, how did you finance the war in Australia? He said, we used the People's Bank. Yeah, but I mean, what was the limit? He said the limit was what the Australian people could do. Yeah, but what does that mean? Well, he said, I'll give you an example. Let's suppose we wanted to build a warship. We ask questions like this. Do we have enough steel? Yes. Do we have a dry docks to build it in? Yes. Do we have engineers? Yes. Do we have painters? Yes. Do we have a crew that's going to go on this ship when it's made? Yes. All right, there's the check, get it done. The limiting factor is the materials and the know-how and the manpower. Well, they said, what was the limit? He said the limit, we reckoned, was that we could have fought that war all over again had we had to do so because we had that much reserves of material. The price we paid were in the dead who died on the battlefield, but there wasn't a financial price. Incidentally, during that war in 1915, we built the Transcontinental Railway from Perth to Sydney with Australian steel made at Newcastle and Australian men, and we didn't borrow a cent. The money was just released through the bank and written off as that railway was built. Think of that as we're now building a new railway from Melbourne right up in a circle to Darwin that's going to be foreign owned before it even started. So they said to Denders and Miller, well, if you could do that in wartime, could you do it in peace? And he said, yes. What's the limit? Well, he said, the limit's exactly the same. Only this time we don't need to build warships. We can build schools, or we could build footy fields, or we could just drop taxis down so that they're an incident. We could do anything we want, and what should be done is decided by the people through their parliament. So it came to the crunch question, where do you get the money? He said, we created it. And they all fell about holding their heads saying, oh, God, you can't create money. Didn't you know that? That's the 11th commandment out of the Bible. Creating money is inflationary. You're going to end up like Germany. So he pulled a £5 note out of his pocket and he held it up and he said, would you agree this came off a printing press? And they didn't quite know how to answer that. Finally, a young, naive reporter said, yeah, well, obviously it came off a printing press. Well, he said, the only question now is the printing press inside Australia or is it outside Australia? If it is inside Australia, we run our own destiny. If it's outside Australia, we lose our country. And that's the key to the whole thing. Now, we're about somewhere between 85% and 90% foreign owned now. We are, I think, equal number one in the world for the level of foreign ownership. And we've just had a huge survey done in this country by Quantum Research. Now, we have polls, every time there's going to be a vote or an election, and the polls are normally pretty crazy, and they have bets on whether horse one's going to win or horse two's going to win, and mostly they get it wrong. But this Quantum Research program that they have is run every year in Australia. It's very extensive, and they sell the results for $20,000. And it is bought by banks and insurers and governments and parties, and this one, they've just had a big write-up on it in the Australian, and it was very interesting, their conclusion. The first conclusion was, we are entering the most volatile period in Australian history. People are really angry with what is going on. And the issues that came out were these. Certainly, multinational companies are spooked by the resurgence of public interest in Australian-made and owned products, with food and pharmaceuticals on the front line. Kraft has taken to full-page print advertisements to reminding peanut butter buyers that its brand is made from 100% Queensland peanuts and supports Australian farmers and families. They don't tell you, though, that the profits go out of this country. Australia Scan says companies should expect more volatility, should 60% of the 2,000 annual respondents believe globalization is dangerous, and a threat to our way of life. Although asked before the outbreak of foot and mouth disease in the UK, public concerns about food poisoning were up 17%.